Welcome to this explainer. We tend to think of globalization as a totally modern thing, right? Driven by the internet, cargo planes, global supply chains. But the truth is, the actual foundation, the fundamental circuitry of our world, was laid down centuries ago. Today, we're going to uncover how just a handful of wooden ships completely rewired the planet, and in the process, established the global economy that you and I rely on every single day. Let's get right into it.
So, how exactly did a few ships rewire the global economy forever? It's a massive question. For a long time, history has kind of been taught with this sense of inevitability, like European global dominance was just destined to happen. But today, we're throwing that idea out. We're going to see how global power dynamics actually shifted almost overnight, taking these isolated regional markets and smashing them together into a fierce, globally integrated machine.
To really understand this new machine, we basically just need to wrap our heads around one totally staggering number: 16,000. That is the sheer tonnage of silver that flowed directly from the Americas to Europe between 1500 and 1650. To put that into perspective, that silver acted as the absolute lifeblood of this new world system. It was literally pumping wealth across oceans and fueling entire empires. But how did those connections get built in the first place? That brings us to Section 1, Connecting a Divided World, the Catalyst for Global Integration. Okay, so we first have to look at the massive spatial shock that connected all these previously isolated regional markets into one single continuous loop. Because crossing the oceans wasn't just about, discovery. The historical record is very clear here. It unleashed the largest demographic catastrophes in human history, while simultaneously kickstarting this relentless, unprecedented web of trade routes. Suddenly, Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas were linked in literally every direction. And just look at how incredibly fast this all happened. In less than a single century, we're talking from Columbus in 1492 to the founding of Manila in 1571. An entirely new global network was forged. Think about that. For the very first time, the emerging Atlantic circuits were directly plugged into the ancient, massively wealthy routes of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Moving on to Section 2, Mercantilism and State Power, the operating system of the 16th to 18th centuries. Right, so to understand how these new global networks actually functioned on a day-to-day basis, we have to look at their ruthless economic operating system, and that system was mercantilism. The definition here is just fascinating. Rather than the sort of free trade we champion today, mercantilism was basically a cutthroat, state-sponsored monopoly game. Wealth, specifically hoarding gold and silver bullion, which are those raw, uncoined blocks of precious metal, was viewed as completely finite. So centralized powers aggressively intervened in the economy. They wanted to secure every single piece of the pie for themselves. Now, the really crucial point is how this played out geographically. This system established a highly unequal loop. On one side, you have the mother country, right, hoarding bullion and manufacturing goods. On the other side, the colonies. Under this operating system, their sole purpose was to provide raw materials and act as captive, forced markets. They were strictly prohibited from developing any of their own competing local industries. And rulers used absolutely everything at their disposal to enforce this setup. The 17th century British Navigation Acts are a perfect example. They used legislation, heavily armed joint stock companies, and even outright colonial wars to just completely lock out rivals, like the Dutch, for instance. They wanted to guarantee that every drop of colonial revenue funneled straight back into their own treasuries. It was aggressive, it was highly militarized, and, well, it was incredibly effective. Which leads us to Section 3. Silver fuels the global web, the battery of the world economy. So if mercantilism was the operating system, silver was absolutely the battery keeping this massive global machine running. Tracing the flow of silver perfectly illustrates this whole new global supply chain. Step 1. It was violently extracted from American mines using devastating, coerced labor. Step 2. It was shipped all over the globe on these massive Spanish galleons. And Step 3. It was ultimately absorbed by vast Asian markets. But wait, why China? Why was all this unprecedented wealth flowing east? Well, China enacted laws in the 1570s that required taxes to be paid in silver. Add to that a population that was, at the time, one-third of the entire world's total, and you instantly have a massive domestic demand for currency. And here's the truly wild part. Silver prices in China were actually double what they were in Spain. So in this massive setup, Europe was essentially playing the role of a middleman.
The actual driving force of this global trade? That was China's insatiable demand for silver to monetize its massive, totally self-sufficient economy. The sheer scale of that demand is just mind-boggling. The famous Manila galleons carried upwards of 50 tons of silver every single year, all the way across the Pacific, linking Acapulco directly over to Manila. This massive trans-Pacific route entirely bypassed Europe to directly feed those highly lucrative Asian markets, swapping American silver for Chinese silk and porcelain. Moving to Section 4, the Ottoman counter-exploration, the rival network in the Indian Ocean. Okay, let's take a second to shatter the myth that global exploration was exclusively a European game, because we really need to talk about the powerful Ottoman Empire. People often ask, why didn't the Ottomans sail across the Atlantic? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. They didn't look west because the real wealth was in the east. They made a very logical pivot to fiercely contest the Portuguese for dominance over the insanely lucrative Indian Ocean spice trade. And their strategic maneuvers were highly, highly calculated. They conquered Egypt in 1517 specifically to get access to the Red Sea. They claimed the title of Universal Caliphate to project power over Muslims in the Indian Ocean. They supplied advanced artillery to distant allies in places like Yemen and India, and they organized these massive state-owned spice convoys. By utilizing state-sponsored commerce and advanced military tech, the Ottomans effectively grabbed the lion's share of the spice trade right back from the Portuguese by the mid-16th century. Section 5. The Human and Ecological Cost. Rewiring the Biosphere. Look, we absolutely cannot talk about this economic integration without facing the terrifying human and ecological price it exacted. What historians call the Columbian Exchange fundamentally, irrevocably altered the planet's biosphere. Because indigenous populations in the Americas tragically lacked immunity to Old World diseases, millions perished. And this catastrophic loss of life led European colonizers to ruthlessly import millions of enslaved Africans to meet the brutal labor demands of their new cash crop plantations. Alongside that horrific human toll, there was an unprecedented ecological swap. To the New World went horses, cattle, pigs, sugar, and, of course, those devastating diseases. This led to severe ecological disruption and the rise of plantation monocultures. But flowing back to the Old World were incredibly nutrient-dense crops. Think about potatoes in Ireland or tomatoes in Italy, staples we just take for granted today. They were a direct result of this specific swap. And the result for Afro-Eurasia? A massive population explosion that basically provided the demographic fuel necessary for the upcoming industrial age. Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Origins of the Great Divergence, the ultimate economic output. Ultimately, this entire age of exploration and exploitation culminated in what economic historians call the Great Divergence. You see, before 1800, both ends of Eurasia, Western Europe and East Asia, were hitting some really severe ecological limits. They were literally running out of land and resources. But to survive, they chose two completely different paths. East Asia doubled down on a highly efficient, labor-intensive route. Western Europe, on the other hand, went down a capital and land-intensive path. So how exactly did Western Europe manage that? Well, it was through what historians call an ecological windfall. The New World essentially provided Europe with millions of acres of ghost acreage. Basically, they were using external land across the ocean to grow their crops. By extracting land-intensive resources, things like sugar, timber, and cotton, from the colonies using slave labor, Europe didn't actually have to sacrifice its own precious domestic land. This massive influx of external resources gave Western Europe the vital ecological breathing room it desperately needed to eventually spark the Industrial Revolution. The historian Alfred Crosby perfectly captures the sheer scale of this shift. He notes, "The coming together of the continents was a prerequisite for the population explosion of the past 2 centuries, and certainly played an important role in the Industrial Revolution." It's so true. Without this brutal, monopolistic, and totally transformative global rewiring of the age of exploration, the modern industrial world as we know it today simply could not exist. And that leaves us with this final kind of provocative thought. If mercantilism built the foundation of our modern global trade network using strict monopolies, state-sponsored companies, and aggressive tariffs, are today's global trade wars really anything new? As we look at the tariffs, the state interventions, and the trade disputes that are dominating our headlines right now, we really have to ask ourselves, are we entering a new era, or are we still just running on a modern update of that exact same mercantilist operating system? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.